Hello class, this is lecture 6C, and we're going to cover other nutrients, namely potassium, calcium, and magnesium. And we're also going to go over fertilizers. So our objectives for this lecture, we're going to review potassium, the potassium cycle, and potassium management strategies. We'll go over briefly calcium and magnesium. And then you'll just learn how to describe different types of fertilizers and soil amendments and provide examples of each. Determine nutrient content of commercial fertilizers based on the label. You'll learn how to compare costs of fertilizer sources and understand how soil tests are conducted and how. So potassium is not incorporated into the structure of organic compounds. So it's usually just a free cation that's floating around cells, around the soil, and so on. It usually stays dissolved, and but it is used to activate a variety of enzymes. So that's one of the primary functions within your bodies, as well as within the bodies of cells. One important use of potassium is it's used to lower cellular osmotic potential. So cells can increase or decrease turgor pressure by making water move in and out by controlling the direction the potassium is flowing. So this can help plants adapt to different environmental conditions, and and also cells can lose less water to the atmosphere as a result. And in addition, roots can take up more water from the soil. So potassium doesn't cause any off-site environmental issues. So it's not like phosphorus or nitrogen where we can get algae blooms either in fresh water or salt water. So potassium does not cause any off-site environmental issues. It's a cation, and so its storage depends on the cation exchange capacity. And if plants are deficient, the main way we notice this is yellowing on the leaves and necrosis or death, particularly on the edges of the oldest leaves in the plant. So on the picture on the right, you can see what nitrogen looks like, yellowing, kind of going down the main vein. Potassium is mainly on the edges, and then there's cell death on the edges. And then also compared to phosphorus, where it's purple and a normal leaf. So the potassium cycle recently went through an update. So a bunch of world experts had several conferences for a couple years in a row, so they could create a better potassium cycle that's more representative. Now, what was previously in the textbooks looked something like this, where you had the soil solution potassium. There was some loss to leaching. Then you have mineral potassium, fixed potassium, exchangeable potassium. So there's a lot of oversimplification happening here. And then we had this plant uptake where it would go into the plants. We had some loss to harvest, some residues where potassium was returned, and we have other inputs like animal manures and biosolids. We get losses to runoff, and then we have inputs from mineral fertilizers. So that was the traditional textbook version. So the IPNI Frontiers of Soil Potassium Work Group met, and in 2015 they came up with their final version out of many years of work. Or in 2015 and 2017 they had their main meetings, and after 2017 they finalized their new potassium cycle. So this is the consensus of the world's experts in potassium. And there's a new book coming out about the new potassium cycle. But here is the cycle. So they haven't had a graphic designer go through this, obviously, but we still have the soil solution potassium at the center. And then from that soil solution, we have plants that are at potassium that is in plants in the green, or unharvested plants also in green. So this is living biomass. and there is some feedback to the soil solution. There's some loss due to harvested plant potassium, so the potassium that's in the grain or in biomass if it's forage. There's some loss due to erosion and runoff. And then we have inputs, which include a variety of things. Could be manure, could be biosolids, could be compost, or it could be potassium fertilizer. So we have all those inputs. And then within the soil, there's a few new changes. So one is they went into more detail about the types of different minerals and how potassium works. So we have secondary minerals that aren't fully fledged examples of, say, a 2-to-1 clay. And then we have other primary minerals like feldspars that potassium would be included in. And as those weather, that can lead to additional soil solution potassium. And then we have some potassium that's absorbed on colloid surfaces. And what can happen is a colloid, if there's enough potassium around it, can actually collapse on the potassium and trap it. And if that happens enough, eventually we can actually form, we can have mica. So we can, or have a version of mica. So as mica weathers, it forms some of these sort of half-weathered minerals. And then, and as mica weathers further, it just ends up in potassium being on the edges. So here's an example. So here we have potassium, and it's in a clay where there's some interlayer expansion, so the potassium is in between, and it's hydrated, meaning that there's water surrounding it. And then what can happen is this hydrated layer, if it dries out, can actually cause the clay to collapse. And so this is sort of the reverse of weathering. So here we have mica with potassium in between. So this would be like a 2-to-1 layer, or a 2-to-1 clay. And then on the other side we have hydrated potassium. So here we have a shrink swell clay. And we can actually move back and forth depending on the field conditions. So potassium can reverse the weathering of mica, depending on the right. There's a few more details there, but I've kind of covered the main points that I want to cover. All right, so one application of this mica weathering is shown in this figure. So they had a long-term experiment where back in the 1800s, an area was deforested, and then it was used for cropping. And so during this period, there was no fertilizer or no potassium fertilizer added, but yet they took samples every so often to figure out how much available potassium there was. And so available potassium started out high, sort of as a steady state under forest conditions. And after foresting and many years of cropping, we have removal of potassium due to the harvest of the crops, as well as leaching and so on. And then in about 1930s or 40s, they reforested the site, and they split into two treatments. One was an unfertilized forest, and the other one, they went and added potassium fertilizer. And so they added potassium fertilizer that brought it back up to the steady state condition. But eventually, the unforested site reached the same steady state condition. And it's kind of odd that without adding fertilizer, suddenly we have this back to normal amount of potassium available to plants through our soil testing. But what was happening here is we have potassium that was weathering out from the mica. So as mica was breaking down, it was splitting open, allowing this trapped potassium to go out in a solution. And eventually that made the amount of soil test potassium become available again. And so our two treatments ended up, after about 70 years, ended up being about the same level again. So in ecosystems, the long-term source of potassium is weathering of mica and similar minerals. but we can speed that up by adding our own potassium. Okay, so one thing to consider with this, and going back to the new potassium model, is that it could be more convenient to apply potassium in less frequent applications. But frequent applications actually require the least amount of fertilizer. And the reason for that is plants actually will have luxury consumption of potassium. So plants love potassium, and so if they have plenty of available, they will acquire as much potassium as they can. So they love potassium, and so it actually ends up increasing how much potassium is removed from the field through harvest because there's so much extra potassium in the grain or in the biomass. In addition, if we have too high potassium in the solution, we can actually have potassium fixation where we are reversing this mica weathering. So we can actually cause weathered mica to recollapse onto the potassium and fix it for many years, making it no longer available. So we don't want to do that because people pay money for that potassium, and if you're paying money for that potassium, you don't want it to be fixed by the mineral and not be available anymore. Okay, a couple quick notes on calcium. So calcium is an important component of cell walls, and in some scenarios, it can be the most limiting at points of growth, so stems and root tips. So calcium is really used as a structural component, and also in many forest systems, particularly for loblolly plantations, calcium can be the most limiting nutrient because it's so important for structural components, and it's part of wood. So if there's not enough calcium, then trees can't grow at their optimum level. Calcium is also important for making things like aluminum and manganese less toxic. So we've talked about aluminum before, and aluminum toxicity at low pH, and adding calcium through gypsum or through liming can offset the issues that we get with too much aluminum. Same goes for manganese. Calcium is also important along with magnesium for limiting the impacts of sodium in the soil. So calcium, being divalent, does a really good job at aggregating clays and offsetting the dispersion caused by too high of levels of sodium. Calcium is generally taken up by young roots, not so much old roots, and it can be very limiting in acid soils. And as I mentioned, this is definitely the case in tree production. Now, how we diagnose calcium deficiencies is usually through stunted growth, or if we have aluminum and manganese toxicity, despite having low aluminum or manganese available in soil tests. For magnesium, it is an important component of chlorophyll. So for plants, it's obviously pretty important. Forages that have low contents of magnesium compared to calcium and potassium can actually cause grazing animals like cattle to develop what we call magnesium deficiency or a grass tetany. So if there's too high potassium, this can also aggravate it. So potassium toxicity and magnesium deficiency kind of go hand in hand. They're diagnosed through the same symptoms in animals. So the end result is grass tetany. The way that we can resolve this is we can add dolomitic limestone compared to regular calcium carbonate limestone. So instead of CaCO3 for calcitic limestone, we have CaMgCO3. So calcium and magnesium along with carbonate. And so we can both lime our soils to alleviate any pH concerns while also adding fertilizer in the form of this magnesium that's in our dolomitic limestone. How we would diagnose a magnesium deficiency is usually through intraveinal chlorosis. So here you see this corn plant that's magnesium deficient. So in between the veins, we have this striping that's occurring. And so also in this picture here, we have chlorosis or yellowing in between each of the veins. And that's caused by a magnesium deficiency. All right, so that's going to wrap up the other nutrients component of this lecture. Now we're going to move on to fertilizers. So there are many types of fertilizers, everything from bone meal to guano to anhydrous, fish emulsion, miracle products that have all sorts of other built-in features. Could be manure, lots of different types. And with fertilizers, really what we're referring to is any substance, or it could be inorganic or organic. Or what I mean by that is chemical or inorganic fertilizers like rock phosphate, things like that. Or it could be organic in terms of manure or compost and so on. So any substance that's going to supply plants with essential nutrients that the plant needs to grow. So examples are anhydrous, bone meal, manure, fish meal, limestone, guano, and so on. So lots of different examples are out there. For commercial fertilizers are always labeled with a 3-number label. So in this case, we have 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus as phosphate, or P2O5, even though that's not the correct version of phosphate. It's still, by convention, how they label phosphorus in our fertilizers. And then we have 10% available potash, or K2O. So nitrogen is always listed as the percent of nitrogen, but if we want it as a percent of pure phosphorus, we need to factor out the weight of this oxygen, and same with potassium. And I'll show you how to do that shortly. So here's an example. All right, so say we have a 5-20-20 mix for our fertilizer. It's 5% nitrogen, 20% P2O5, 20% K2O. Get my animations click through here. All right, so to go from 20% P2O to the percent of phosphorus, if we determine the molecular weight of phosphorus out of the total molecular weight of P2O5, we find that phosphorus is 44% of the molecular weight of P2O5. So that means we could take this percent times 44, or 0.44, and we get 9. Do the same math for K2O. So there's 2 potassiums out of a total weight, so 2 potassiums and 1 oxygen. K2O is 83% potassium by mass. And so that means we could take 20% times 0.83, and we get 16% potassium. So 5-20-20, looking at it on an elemental basis, is 5% N, 9% P, 16% K. That would be our best bet for the most bang for the buck. All right, so so now we've covered the content of the nutrients, or at least the NPK and fertilizers, and how to do a cost comparison. Now let's talk about types. So there are single carriers, which only contain one of the 3 main nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So anhydrous ammonia, 8100, would be an example of a single carrier. Mixed fertilizers have 2 of the 3. So in this case, we have 1846. So we have 18% nitrogen, 46% K2O. And then a complete fertilizer is something that contains nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. So an example would be 12-12-12. So there are a bunch of different mixes out there, but a complete fertilizer has all 3 of nitrogen. There's also some nitrification inhibitors that will slow this down too, like N-Serve is one example of those. So a couple of different types of fertilizers. All right, now how we actually make fertilizer recommendations. So fertilizer recommendations are based on soil tests with actual yield responses. So generally these are empirical experiments or empirical data where someone actually went out and applied, say, nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium at different rates on one particular field site, and they looked at the yield responses that they got for those data. Now we also want to fertilize based on our soil test recommendations. So if we just fertilize without data, in this case soil tests, then we might be over fertilizing, which is going to cost us more money, or we might be under fertilizing, which is going to result in lower yields and cut into profits. So in both cases, soil tests they make good economical sense. Now there's really two types of philosophies for soil tests. One is sufficiency, where we are only applying fertilizers that are to make it sufficient for that year's crop. There's also build and maintain, where we're applying at a higher rate to actually increase the soil levels over time. All right, so to collect a soil sample, the best thing to do is collect a whole bunch of subsamples, make sure they're all equal size and all down to the same depth, and do this throughout the whole field or yard or garden. If you're doing it for a field, it's good to break it up by soil mapping units or different managing units for the field, whatever size you want to do, and then use a clean shovel, trowel, or a soil sample to collect those. Next, what you want to do is take all of your samples and put all of them into a clean bucket, and then you're going to stir it thoroughly to make a composite sample. So it would cost a lot if we had to submit one sample for every single little subsample we take. So what we do is we compile it or composite the samples into one, and then submit a portion of that mixed sample to the lab. And so we need about a pint of soil or a couple cups worth, and we can put that in a sample bag, or you can just use a Ziploc bag. And then when you submit it, there's a form that you fill out, and put your name, contact info, billing info, and so on. And also you check off the test that you actually want completed. So you can submit these samples directly to the K-State Soil Testing Lab, which is in Throckmorton Hall, or you can do it through your local county extension office.
And when you get results back, it's going to look something like this. So you'd have your lab sample number and sample ID, and then you'd have your soil pH, buffer pH, and so on. So this section is all the soil test results. And then below that is all the recommendations for lime and fertilizer for what you filled out on the form for your planned crops or forages or what have you. And if you are doing turf, you can get your recommendations using your soil test results, but you can get recommendations using the Guide to Turf Grass Nutrient Recommendations PDF, which was one of the recommended readings for this lecture, or one of the assigned readings. And for horticultural crops, you can also get recommendations based on your soil testing results by using the tables in the extension publication called Fertilizing Gardens in Kansas. Also one of the assigned readings for today. All right, so most of these recommendations are based on a yield response curve. And this is what a curve looks like. So we have our yield in bushels per acre on the y-axis and fertilizer added on the x-axis. So this could be fertilizer added, or it could be soil test phosphorus or potassium or nitrogen or so on. So as we increase the fertility, we get a yield return. And so at some point, we get to a point where it plateaus. And it generally doesn't start going down, except for certain cases. But there is sort of a law of diminishing returns. So the first 50 pounds of fertilizer added, we had a 50 bushel per acre increase. Next 50 pounds, 40 bushels. Next 50 pounds, 25. And so we get less and less return with each additional 50 pounds of fertilizer that was added. So that is sort of normal for what we see for our response curves. So from 50 pounds to 40 pounds to 25 pounds, and eventually we don't get any additional benefit from adding more fertilizer. Now, most state soil testing labs, when they give recommendations, those recommendations are based on calibrations where we have our soil test, in this case phosphorus, using the Bray phosphorus extractant. So Bray is just a method. There's 3 different methods that the soil testing lab uses. But for this one, you can see that we have our very low soil test phosphorus, low, medium, high, very high, and environmental risk range. So and then we have our response, our yield response. And eventually we get to the point where there's no additional benefit. And we have kind of 2 ways that we give phosphorus fertilizer recommendations. Sufficiency is everything up to 20 parts per million, which would put us at about a 95% return on the relative yield based on increasing our soil test phosphorus. But then at 100%, so the top of the curve, that's like the end of the maintenance range. And so we have a build and maintain recommendation, which would be how much phosphorus we need to go from 0 up to 30 parts per million. While sufficiency is just enough to get us into this maintenance range, so 20 parts per million. And so build and maintain is usually higher or a higher rate than what we'd have for sufficiency. And so if you just want, I guess one example would be if you're renting ground and you're not sure if your lease is going to be renewed, then you don't want to add any extra fertilizer because that's just extra cost. So in that case, you might do sufficiency. But maybe one year, phosphorus fertilizer for some reason is particularly cheap, and that you're not going to use the land again in future years. Then in that case, you might apply at a higher rate. So that phosphorus is there. You're going to be able to recover most of it in future crops. So it's kind of insurance in case there's a year where maybe grain prices are low and you don't want to apply phosphorus. Now this is more relevant for both horticultural crops and row crops, where we're trying to actually get a yield. For lawn care and golf courses and so on, there's usually just kind of a base rate that we apply. We generally don't apply beyond that. All right, now I have a couple of things to discuss with fertilizer. And one is you need to be aware of how things are marketed. So there are a lot of different fertilizers out there, and not all of them are completely straightforward with what's actually trying to be marketed to you. And so this is just one example. I got into an argument with this guy on Twitter because he put this picture on Twitter, and his experiment doesn't actually show what was being tested. So what he was marketing is fish manure, what he calls fish manure. And so they have some aquaculture facilities where the pools where the fish are grown, after they harvest a round of fish, they'll go through, drain the tanks, and they'll scoop up all the manure or all the fish excrement that's on the ground. And then they can't remember if they compost that or if they just sell it as is, but they market it as fish manure. And so what they did is they had 2 marigolds. One they applied fish manure, and the other one they didn't. And obviously the one that had fish manure applied was bigger. And so his what he's inferring with this is that fish manure is a good fertility source, which I'm not doubting that. But what's really being tested is, does this marigold respond to added nitrogen? So what he should have done is do a test where we're adding, or where he's adding so many pounds per acre or ounces per flower pot or whatever of nitrogen to one pot, and then add, say, a chemical fertilizer or an equal amount of nitrogen in compost or something else to a different pot. And that way, he's not measuring just the nitrogen response, he's actually measuring whether or not fish manure is a good alternative to compost or a good alternative to chemical fertilizer. So in this case, the question that was actually investigated was not what he was trying to use for his marketing pitch. And I see this all the time on magazine articles and or advertisements and Twitter examples and so on. So just need to be cognizant of what's actually being said. All right, now some people might try to say that fertilizers are toxic, and the best example of why it's not the case is Rothamsted in England is the oldest agriculture research station in the world. So they've had a fertilizer plot going since 1843, and that plot is more productive today than at any time in the past because it's been continually fertilized. But there are caveats to that. So long term, it's not a problem. It's not going to reduce or not going to reduce the productivity of land. Short term, there are fertilizers like anhydrous ammonia, for example, which is knifed. This is a gas, and it's knifed into the soil. And where it's injected, that application zone, it can denature the soil organic matter that's there, and it might sort of sterilize and kill off some of the microbes that are in the immediate vicinity of the anhydrous. But within a few weeks, everything's back to normal. So there might be some short-term effects from fertilization. I mean, in most cases, you're adding a salt to the soil, or in this case, you're adding a gas. So in the immediate vicinity of where that's applied, you might have some issues. But as things kind of come back to normal, it all goes back to normal. So it's not really a problem. There are environmental risks. So it's not a risk to the soil long term, but there are environmental risks. The biggest one is that there's water quality problems. So, uh, so if you have too many nitrates that are leached out of a soil profile, or you have erosion and there's phosphorus that's bound to that sediment, then those can definitely cause environmental problems. Nitrate poses a drinking water risk, and it can contribute to eutrophication. In freshwater, it's not the primary cause of eutrophication generally, but it can contribute to it. And nitrate is also the leading cause of eutrophication in oceans. So the dead zone off of the coast of Louisiana, where the Mississippi flows out, is draining the Corn Belt and the rest of the Midwest, and it drains out into the Gulf of Mexico. That dead zone is caused by all the nitrate that is moved out of that watershed out into the ocean. So saltwater is nitrogen limited, and so that's why nitrate is a concern from an ocean standpoint. Phosphorus is the primary limiting nutrient in freshwaters. So phosphorus isn't toxic, but it does contribute to eutrophication. So it's the most limited nutrient for algae. Then algae is going to take on that phosphorus, start to multiply. Eventually, you get an algae bloom. The algae dies, decomposes, and that decomposition is what actually triggers fish kills and stuff. All right, so, and actually I just explained this term. So eutrophication. We get algae that's growing and it's stimulated by a fertilizer, because algae is either autotrophic microbes, or there's also some that are plants, or something analogous to plants. So we have algae as it has more nitrogen and phosphorus, it's going to bloom. And again, as it dies, goes to the bottom of the water column, and it's decomposed by bacteria, and that uses up oxygen, and when the oxygen is used up, then fish die. So how do we reduce our pollution? So the best way is to increase nutrient efficiency. So we can use that with technology, with improved plant breeding, biotechnology. We can also time our fertilizer applications so that the time of the year when the fertilizer is in need by the plant is close to the time that we actually apply it. And we can also do treatments to fertilizer to delay that time so that when it's available coincides with when the demand is. And we can also use cover crops so that there's no leakage from the system during the time of the year when there's not as much nitrogen demand. And also practices that we can do that reduce runoff or reduce erosion are going to greatly reduce how much pollution we get from fertilizer applications. So there's definitely improved fertilizer efficiency in the world today. So today farmers produce a third more corn per pound of nitrogen than we did 30 years ago. So that's just one example of improved fertilizer efficiency. And the way that's been done is improved soil sampling and testing, tillage methods, also advances in fertilizer compounds, and improvements on timing and replacement and placement of fertilizer. And the impact is if we can grow more crops per acre, that will leave more land for nature. So we can have less of an environmental impact if we can maintain our level of production on the same amount of land without having to expand our acreage of land that's used for agriculture. So that's the idea behind that quote. And the benefit is that we can kind of optimize plant nutrition, and as a result, we have less of an impact on climate change because there's less land going into production. There's hopefully less greenhouse gases being produced in the process because we're confined to a smaller area. And also, if it's done right, we can increase consumption of CO2 and hopefully release oxygen. All right, so one question is, would it be better to use less fertilizer? And the answer is no. And the reason for that is if we don't apply sufficient fertilizer, then crops will still want to acquire as much nutrients as they can. And so they will mine the soil for the nutrients that are needed. And so that actually further decreases the amount of fertility of a given soil. So it's going to be a detriment to the soil over time. So if we don't add sufficient fertilizer, we're going to decrease the soil health of that particular soil. And as a result, over time, yields will decrease. We'll have less plant growth because the plants are nutrient limited. And also nutrient limited plants or nutrient stressed plants are more susceptible to disease and weather stresses. So it's really important from an overall both soil health and plant health perspective to have proper fertility by adding sufficient nutrients. We'll also have less crop biomass because the plants will be smaller because they're nutrient limited. And as a result, there's less cover, there's less residue, and as a result, we'll have more soil erosion. So we can actually have environmental impacts from not applying enough fertilizer. Now, one question I might be asking is, are USDA organic farming methods better? And the short answer is not necessarily. So organic farming still uses fertilizer. So that just comes in a different form. So it could be manure, sewage sludge, compost, what have you. But it's difficult to move all that massive material. So in some cases, organic forms of fertilizer are seldom sufficient to meet the high yield demands. And also related to that, we can't fine tune the exact additions of all of our nutrients. And so if we're using manure as our nitrogen source, then manure is very high in phosphorus, and so we're going to be over applying on phosphorus. Or if we're applying it just based on the phosphorus rate, we're not going to have enough nitrogen. And so most organic forms of nutrients in terms of compost or manure or so on, they're not in the right balance of nutrients that are needed for crops. So it's really difficult to find that balance. So going back to my example of manure, manure is really high in phosphorus, and so if we apply it to have just enough nitrogen, we're usually applying phosphorus at a rate that's 4 to 5 times the amount needed. So this can result in eutrophication. So there's actually water quality concerns if the only source of nutrients is manure. All right, now in terms of soil health, there hasn't really been any evidence that's been shown that we have a significant difference in microbial communities between soils under organic practices and soils under non-organic practices. Part of that is we as humans like to put things in little boxes, and we assume that there's no gray area between those boxes. The truth is there are some USDA organic operations or practices that are less helpful to soil health, and there are also some non-organic methods that are more helpful. And so there's a lot of room in the middle where there's overlap. And so there's, for one example is, I know plenty of farmers that are not organic, but they use cover crops, they use no-till, and those practices will greatly help improve soil health. There's also lots of organic practices that use very intensive tillage to control weeds because they can't spray with herbicide. And so that additional tillage is a huge detriment to soil health and also soil erosion. So what's more important is the cropping system and how tillage is used and the types of crop rotations that are used. What's less important is whether it's labeled organic or not. All right, so the best way to save money and also minimize pollution is we want to apply fertilizer only at the recommended agronomic rate. So whatever you get as a recommended rate from the soil testing lab, that's what should be applied. And also to apply at a higher rate than that is against the law. So it actually makes a farm switch from being exempt from water quality laws in the Clean Water Act to becoming a point source polluter using industrial applications of pollutants. So nobody wants that because it brings in a whole other range of enforcements that can happen on land. So we want to apply only at the agronomic rate and never above that. We need to soil test to actually figure out what the recommended rate is. And we also want to apply our nutrients and the fertilizer as close to the time when the plants are actually going to need it to make it as efficient as possible. In addition, we want to manage the pH appropriately, and we also want to do what we can to minimize erosion and surface runoff. So the best ways to do that are use no-till or use practices that slow the water down, like terracing, contour cropping, and so on. And we can also use legumes and non-legume cover crops to conserve soil. And also, if they're leguminous, we get free nitrogen. So that's a big benefit. Watch out for a lot of snake oil soil amendments. When something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. So watch out for